On the morning of the 5th of June, 2022, two men climbed into a small aluminum boat. The Itaquai is a tributary of the Javari on the border of Brazil and Peru, in the far west of the state of Amazonas. Their names were Bruno da Cunha Araújo Pereira and Dom Phillips. Pereira was 41 years old, a Brazilian federal civil servant, a specialist in the protection of uncontacted indigenous people. Phillips was 57, a British journalist. He had been writing a book about whether the Amazon could be saved. 10 days later, their burned and dismembered remains were recovered from a forest grave near the mouth of the Itaquai. 3 fishermen were arrested. The federal police later named a Colombian fish trader as the man who had paid them. The names of the killers are public. The motive is on the record. Pelado has confessed and led the police to the body. 4 years on, the Brazilian federal courts have not produced a single conviction. This is the question the case outlives. In a country where illegal fishing, gold mining, and indigenous land violence are documented and named, where the men charged with the killings have been in custody for almost 4 years, why does the criminal justice process not produce a verdict even when the killers are known? This channel is called the Quiet Hill. This is the case of Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips. Chapter 1, Bruno Pereira, Bruno da Cunha Araújo Pereira was born on the 15th of August, 1980, in Recife, on the northeast coast of Brazil, far from the Amazon. Then he joined the FUNAI, the Fundação Nacional do Índio, the National Indigenous Foundation. Over a decade and a half, he worked his way into the agency's most demanding specialty, the protection of uncontacted and recently contacted indigenous groups. He learned the languages of the Javari peoples well enough to function. He learned of the rivers. He spent months at a time inside the territory. Colleagues described him as part of the new generation of sertanistas, the backwoods specialists, but trained for a different era, one in which contact was not the goal, but the protection of no contact was. In 2018, FUNAI named him General Coordinator for Isolated and Recently Contacted Peoples, the senior national post in his specialty. In 2019, he led what was at the time the largest contact expedition the Brazilian state had attempted in 20 years, an operation to make contact with a group of Coda who had been separated from their relatives and were at risk of armed conflict with the neighboring Mastermind. The expedition reached the group. They were vaccinated against measles and influenza, the 2 diseases that have historically devastated newly contacted population. A few months later, in October 2019, he was dismissed from the coordination role. The official explanation was a management restructuring intended to optimize work in progress. No specific accusation was made against him. It came after months of pressure on FUNAI from agribusiness and mining lobbies, and from the inner circle of the recently inaugurated president, Jair Bolsonaro, who had spent his campaign promising he would not demarcate one more centimeter of indigenous. FUNAI was being hollowed out. Pereira's removal was one of dozens across the country of the agency's most experienced field staff. He took an extended leave of absence and went back to the Javari as a consultant, not for the federal government, but for Univaja, the União dos Povos Indígenas do Vale do Javari, an organization founded in 1927 by the 6 contacted peoples of the territory, specifically to monitor and defend their Chapter 2, Dom Phillips, Part 2, Dominic Mark Phillips was born on the 23rd of July 1964 in Babington on the Wirral Peninsula, in the northwest of England. His mother was a Welsh schoolteacher. His father was an Irish accountant who lectured at Liverpool Polytechnic in the early 1990s, working for the dance music magazine Mixmag. He wrote some of the foundational journalism of British club Coda. He is credited with coining the term progressive house. He moved to Brazil in 2007. The initial reason was a book on electronic music. He stayed for the country. He lived in Sao Paulo, then Rio de Janeiro, then Salvador, the capital of the northeastern state of Bahia. He learned Portuguese well enough to interview ministers and fishermen with equal ease. He reported for the Washington Post on Brazil's World Cup and Olympic preparations. He became a long-standing contributor to The Guardian. He wrote for the Financial Times, Bloomberg News, and The Times. In 2013, he met a Brazilian woman named Alessandra Sampaio. They married in 2015 and settled together in Salvador. He had been told by Pereira and others that the river was dangerous. He had decided that the story was worth the risk. He had a wife. He did not have children. By the late 2010s, his reporting had shifted decisively toward the Amazon. He covered the Bolsonaro government's environmental rollback. He covered the 2019 Day of Fire, the coordinated burning of forests by ranchers and land grabbers in the state of Pará. That reporting was nominated for the Gabo Prize Latin American Journalism. In 2021, the Alicia Patterson Foundation awarded him a 1-year fellowship to write a book about whether the Amazon could be saved. Not a polemic, he insisted to friends, but a book about working solutions, about the people who had spent their... The working title was How to Save the Amazon, a journalist's quest for answers. The word fatal would be added later, after. Chapter 3, The Vale do Javari. The Vale do Javari sits in the far west of the Brazilian state of Amazonas, in a corner of the Amazon basin where Brazil, Peru, and Colombia all touch Daya. It is one of the largest contiguous indigenous reserves in Brazil, roughly the size of Austria. Roads do not enter. Almost all movement inside the Vale is by boat in long aluminum hulls or by light aircraft to a handful of dirt strips that around 3,000 contacted indigenous people live inside the territory. In many of the villages, 6 recognized ethnic groups: the Marobo, the Matis, the Maioruna, the Canamari, Culinapano, the Corobo. In addition, the Brazilian Indigenous agency FUNAI estimates that more than 2,000 uncontacted people live deeper in the forest, distributed across at least 14 distinct groups in roughly 19 known villages. But the Brazilian government's own description of the Javari is that it contains the greatest concentration of isolated groups in the Amazon and the world. Nowhere else on the planet is there a denser cluster of people who have, by their own choice and by long history, declined contact with the outside world. The forest of the Javari contains valuable timber. Its rivers contain pirarucu, one of the largest freshwater fish in the world. Its waterways form one segment of a transnational drug corridor that runs from the coca-growing valleys of Peru, Colombia, into the Brazilian river system, Becha, and the small administrative towns at the edge of the reserve Atalaia do Norte on the Brazilian side, Tabatinga and Leticia at the triple frontier are Chapter 4, the trip what Pereira did with Univaja between 2019 and 2022 was simple in concept and dangerous in execution. He helped the indigenous communities build, train, and equip their own surveillance teams to patrol the rivers, document invasions, and photograph illegal fishing camps. They forced the police to act on cases that would otherwise have disappeared into the noise. They also made enemies. Pereira had received explicit threats. They were known to known to FUNAI, known to the federal police, known to produce a protective response from the state. In Atalaia do Norte, he had met the anthropologist Beatriz Matos, who was researching the Matses for her doctorate. They married. They had children. In the spring of 2022, Phillips asked Pereira to take him into the Javari for the book he was writing. It was supposed to be a routine 10-day trip. On Friday, the 3rd of June, Phillips flew into Atalaia do Norte and met Pereira. But on Saturday, the 4th, the two men went upriver into the indigenous territory by boat. They reached Lago do Jaburu, a community at the edge of the reserve, and spent the afternoon and evening interviewing members of the indigenous patrol. On Sunday the 5th, very early before sunrise, they got back into the boat. The plan was to motor down the Itaquai to the São Rafael community, where Pereira had a meeting scheduled with a local indigenous leader. From São Rafael, they would continue downstream the remaining 2 hours or so to Atalaia do Norte, where Phillips would file and they would. Chapter 5, The Disappearance. They reached São Rafael at sunrise. The leader they had come to meet was not there. They waited. They had coffee with the family. They got back in the boat and started downstream toward Atalaya. They were last seen by witnesses on the Itaquai in the stretch of river that runs past a stilt house belonging to a fisherman known locally as Some weeks earlier, in late April, the same Pelado had encountered Pereira on the river and fired a 16-gauge shotgun over his head. A single warning shot, it was witnessed and reported. It did not produce a protective response. Pelado was a known illegal fisherman. He had been written up by Pereira and the patrols. His Pirarucu house had been confiscated. He had a brother, Ozeni, who fished with him. He had a friend, Jefferson da Silva Lima, who also fished with him. What happened on the morning of the 5th of June, according to the federal prosecution's case and Pelado's later confession, was that Pelado and at least one accomplice intercepted the Pereira Phillips boat at high speed. They opened fire from their own boat with hunting rifles. They shot both men. They scuttled their craft and dragged the bodies into the forest. There they dismembered and burned them, scattering the partial remains in a shallow grave under fallen leaves about 3 kilometers into the bush. By that afternoon, when Pereira and Phillips failed to reach Atalaya, Univaja knew something was wrong. The first organized search began on the evening of Sunday the 5th, mounted by Univaja's own patrol. They put boats on the river before the federal forces had filed a report, but in every account by every credible outside observer, the indigenous patrols led the recovery in the first 3 days. The federal response was slow. It was hampered by the remoteness of the lock of equipment in Atalaya. President Bolsonaro himself said publicly that the two men had taken, in his words, an adventure that was not recommended. He did not direct an urgent search. International pressure mounted. The British government raised the case formally through diplomatic channels. The Guardian and the Washington Post wrote daily front-page coverage. By midweek, the case had become a global news story, and the operational tempo of the federal response increased sharply. On Tuesday, the 7th, Marildo da Costa de Oliveira Pelado. The initial charge was illegal possession of ammunition and narcotics. After an anonymous tip, he was held in Atalaya. On Tuesday the 14th, after a week of evidentiary work, blood traces found in Pelado's speedboat, ballistic residue, witness statements from other fishermen, Ozeni da Costa de. On Wednesday the 15th, Pelado confessed. He led federal police, indigenous patrol members, and forensic teams to the burial site. The remains were exhumed. On Friday the 17th, forensic identification confirmed Phillips and Pereira through DNA. On Saturday the 18th, Jefferson da Silva Lima surrendered to police. Dom Phillips was cremated in Anitroium. On the 26th of June, in a private ceremony, they are carried by Alessandra Sampaio. Bruno Pereira was cremated in Paulista in his native Pernambuco, with indigenous funeral rites performed by representatives of the Javari people. Chapter 6, the trigger pullers. Amarildo da Costa de Oliveira Pelado was, at the time of his arrest, in his early 40s. He was born and raised on the Itaquai. He had fished the river his whole adult life. According to the police file, he had been written up multiple times by environmental enforcement, had piraku hauls confiscated, and had been formally barred from fishing inside the Javari Indigenous territory. He had continued to do so. Osini da Costa de Oliveira, his brother, was the partner in the small fishing business. He was named in the same indictment for the killings. In September 2024, a Brazilian Federal Appeals Court accepted Osini's defense appeal and removed him from the murder charge on the grounds that the prosecution's evidence linking him specifically to the killings as opposed to the cover-up did not meet the threshold for a jury trial. He remains under investigation for related crimes. He is no longer one of the men due to face the jury for the murders themselves. Jefferson da Silva Lima Pelado da Dinha was the third trigger puller name. Like Marildo, he fished the Itaquai. He was tied into the same downstream buyers. After Pelado's confession, Jefferson surrendered voluntarily and gave his own statement. He acknowledged having been present and having fired. Brazilian crime reporting through 2024 and 2025 followed the case through a long technical sequence of pre-trial hearings. The initial indictment in 2022 had been filed in the Abetinga, the small city at the Triple Frontier. In January 2025, the Federal Regional Court of the First Region confirmed the formal judicial decision that there was enough evidence to send Amarildo and Jefferson to a jury for the murders. Throughout 2025, there were instruction hearings in which witnesses gave testimony and the defendants were interrogated. In February 2026, the higher court ruled that the actual jury trial would be moved from Tabatinga to Manaus, the state capital, on grounds of judicial security and capacity. As of mid-2026, no jury date has been set. The trigger pullers have not yet been convicted. They are in pre-trial detention and have been continuously since 2022. Chapter 7, The Mastermind. In January 2023, almost 7 months after the killings, the federal police announced publicly that they had identified the mastermind. Federal Police Chief Alexandre Fonde told the Brazilian press, "I have no doubt that Colombia was the mastermind." Colombia was the nickname used along the rivers of the Triple Frontier for years of a man whose legal name in Brazilian filings appears as Rubens Villarcoya. He had multiple identification documents in multiple countries with multiple birthplaces listed. Investigators concluded that he had been born in Puerto Nariño on the Colombian side of the Amazon, near the Triple Frontier. He operated across all three borders. His criminal economy was transnational by design. Federal police described his role as the operational head of a scheme that used illegal fishing in the Javari the highest area to aircraft trade, in particular as both a standalone profit center and as a vehicle from Cayenne trafficking. Iaroku, captured illegally inside the indigenous territory, was iced down, moved by boats through riverbank freezers and border towns. He was sold into the wholesale markets of Manaus and downward to Colombia, Peru, and the export trade. The cash flow from that legitimate-looking fish business was used to launder cocaine proceeds. The same both networks move both. The Bruno Pereira's Indigenous led patrols in seizing illegal catches and feeding evidence to the federal police. Were not merely interrupting fishing, they were threatening the wholesale chain that integrated the fishing with the drug economy. Federal police further alleged that Villar had personally supplied the ammunition used in the killings, had paid the fishermen for the operation, had coordinated the disposal of the bodies. The evidence cited included witness testimony from cooperating defendants, financial records, intercepted communications, and tracing of the specific cartridges recovered. He was arrested in July 2022 on charges related to false identity documents. He was released in October 2022. He was rearrested in December after Brazilian prosecutors argued he had violated the terms of his bail. In June 2023, he was indicted for ordering the murders. The case moved through the federal court system in Amazonas state. In July 2025, a federal court in Amazonas state formally accepted the criminal charges against him in a connection with the killings themselves, illegal fishing, financing and arming of the criminal group, ordering of the executions, concealment of the bodies. As of mid-2026, the trial of Rubens Hilar Coelho has not concluded. He has not been convicted of ordering the murders. Chapter 8, what the record holds. The public profile of the case against Hilar has several pillars, each of which Brazilian press reporting has discussed in some detail. There are cooperating witnesses, fishermen and former associates who have identified Villar as the man who issued orders. There are financial records, bank flows, export documents, warehouse rental records that connect Villar to the freezer operations along the Itaquai and the Solimo. There are intercepted communications. The federal police obtained authorization for surveillance on associates of Villar in late 2022 and have cited specific messages and call patterns from the days around the killing. There is physical evidence, ammunition traceable to a supplier under Villar's control. The case has weaknesses too. Much of the witness evidence is from informants whose own credibility can be attacked. The financial chain is complex and crosses 3 jurisdictions. The intercepted communications are circumstantial. They refer to the operation in coded language that the lawyers will dispute. The ammunition trace, while suggestive, is not by itself proof of personal direction. None of the direct trigger pullers, Velado and Jefferson, has on the public record named Villar as the man who paid them. Brazilian organized prosecutions for cases of this complexity routinely take 5 to 7 years from indictment to verdict. The Vilar case is on something approaching schedule in the Brazilian sense. From the standpoint of the families and of indigenous leadership, the schedule is unconscionable. There is also a jurisdictional problem unique to this case. Vilar's operation spanned 3 countries. Key witnesses live in Peru or Colombia. Key evidence sits in foreign banks. Mutual legal assistance treaties between Brazil, Peru, and Colombia exist, but are slow. In practice, the Brazilian prosecution has to build its case using primarily what it can collect inside Brazilian territory. Chapter 9. The Legacy. Dom Phillips had not finished his book. He had been working on it for 2 years. He had a contract, outlines, a draft of roughly a third of the manuscript, plus extensive notebooks, recorded interviews, voice memos, data. After his death, his widow Alessandra Sampaio gathered the material. The Brazilian environmental journalist Eliane Brum and a group of Phillips's closest professional friends, organized by Jonathan Watts of The Guardian, agreed to finish the book. 6 co-authors read through Phillips's notes, replicated his trips, conducted further interviews, and wrote. They did not draw royalties. The proceeds were directed to Sampaio. How to Save the Amazon, a journalist's fatal quest for answers, was published in May 2025 in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Brazil. The book's argument is what Phillips had said in his original proposal, that the Amazon can be saved, that the work is being done, and that what is required from the rest of the world is the political and financial will to back them. Bruno Pereira's children are growing up in a country where their father's name is part of the public vocabulary of Amazon protection. The renewed FUNAI under the Lula government has named the agency's coordination office for uncontacted peoples after him. The training programs for indigenous patrol teams that Pereira designed are being replicated in other indigenous territories beyond the Javari by other Univaja-like organizations across the Brazilian Amazon, with continued support from the federal indigenous and environmental agencies. In 2024, Univaja received the United Nations Equator Prize, awarded to indigenous and community organizations whose nature-based work had met. The patrols Pereira had helped train continued. The bases continued to operate. The illegal fishing camps continued to appear, to be photographed, to be. The pattern of the work has not changed since 2022. The people doing the work have continued to receive threats. Coda, while naming, does not produce verdicts. Return to the question. The trigger pullers have confessed and have led police to the bodies. The man federal police identifies as the financier has been charged. As of mid-2026, he has not been convicted. The trigger pullers themselves have not been convicted either. Their jury trial, now reassigned to Manaus, has not been scheduled. The first answer is the most prosaic. The Brazilian federal criminal system in cases of organized crime spanning multiple jurisdictions is low. The second answer is evidentiary. To convict a financier of murder in Brazilian law, it's not enough to show that he paid the killers, that he had a motive. The prosecution has to demonstrate that the defendant gave the order. That requires either a direct witness who heard it given or a chain of inferential evidence so airtight that no reasonable doubt. The third answer is structure of the Brazilian organized statutes were rewritten over the past 20 years to handle exactly this category of charge, but their application to a transnational illegal economy operator in the Amazon, as opposed to a corrupt politician in Brasilia, is comparatively new. The fourth answer is the one indigenous leaders have given out loud. VIII Maruba of Univaja told reporters in October 2025, if Dom and Bruno were in the Javari Valley today, they would be killed again. Factors that caused the killings remain the same. The state's presence has improved. It has not closed the river. While the case against Villar moves through the federal system, the corridor he operated and continues to operate. Other Villars run it now. The conviction of one mastermind, even if it eventually comes, is a single trial. The economy is a system. This channel is called Quiet Hill. We come back to the things people did and the silences that around them. Subscribe, and the next one will find you. Until then, keep them in mind, Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips, and they question the case outlives